This is The World This Weekend. Hello, I'm Stephanie Skenderis. Coming up, more hostages arrive in Israel after a tense day of negotiations in the Middle East.
There are mediators, very serious ones, Egypt and Qatar. They insist that it'll happen. The agreement as agreed.
Also tonight, advocates in New York call for an extension after a law created to empower survivors of sexual abuse comes to an end.
Are there people that fell through the cracks that a reasonable extension of this law could protect?
And we'll tell you why artificial intelligence is not just for the birds.
We thought we were listening to a real one, and it was not.
That's later, but first. We begin with developments in the Middle East, where a swap of hostages taken by Hamas and Palestinians being held in Israeli prisons is going ahead. Hamas has released 13 Israelis and 4 Thai nationals today in exchange for 39 Palestinians. But the swap almost didn't happen, and the 4-day truce between Israel and Hamas was almost undone. Philip Lee Shannock tells us about the high-stakes diplomacy that salvaged the fragile peace.
Hundreds out in Tel Aviv holding a vigil marking the 50th day of captivity for hostages held by Hamas. It was touch and go for a few hours earlier today, but another group may soon be reunited with their loved ones. Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen visits some of the lucky ones, Thai and Filipino farm workers who'd been held by Hamas. Like many foreign workers around the world, they came to do the work that the local population would not do for the wages on offer.
So Israel turned to other countries like Thailand, Philippines to fill those jobs.
Mira Sokorov is a professor of political science at Carleton University. She says despite today's delays, so far the agreement between Israel and Hamas to exchange hostages for Palestinians being held in Israeli prisons is working.
This truce, it's very delicate, it's precarious, and it's still only a fraction of the numbers that need to come home.
She says the deal has meant freedom for Palestinians being held in Israel, often without being charged.
They've been held under what Israel calls administrative detention.
50 Israelis and 150 Palestinians are to be exchanged over a 4-day truce. Mama? Those returning to their homes in Gaza during this pause in fighting surveyed the damage done by the Israeli Defense Force shelling. This is much worse than before, says Adnan Barham, who sits in the rubble of his apartment.
But at this point, Palestinians are trying to count their dead.
Budor Hassan is Amnesty International's researcher on Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. She says humanitarian aid must be allowed into Gaza.
But also for this ceasefire to be sustained, because 4 days is absolutely not enough.
Aya Betrawi is the Gulf Bureau Chief for National Public Radio. She says the U.S. and Egypt helped broker the deal between Israel and Hamas, but Qatar also played a crucial role in difficult negotiations.
For many years now, it's played this role of mediating between the West, particularly the U.S., and groups that the U.S. doesn't want to directly have to deal with. So that includes the Taliban at times in Afghanistan. That's included Hamas.
And she says the U.S. encouraged Qatar to allow Hamas to open a mission there so the West would have a point of contact. And with many calling for this 4-day temporary truce to be the foundation of a permanent ceasefire, these back channels will be crucial. Philip Lee Shannock, CBC News, Toronto.
CBC's Margaret Evans is in Jerusalem and has more now on the sticking points that held up today's exchange between Israel and Hamas.
After a day when the short-lived truce between Israel and Hamas seemed in danger of collapse, hope appeared in the form of lights at the Rafah border crossing between Gaza and Egypt, a second hostage release underway. In Tel Aviv, earlier in the day, many Israelis gathered at what's called Hostages Square in the hopes of celebrating another release, the mood shifting dramatically when news of a delay filtered through the crowds.
We are very disappointed because we were thinking they are going to be all children. We are hoping for the baby at the age of 9 months to arrive this evening, and he's not arriving. we are very, very, very afraid it will not happen.
A Hamas spokesman, Osama Hamdan, accused Israel of denying access to aid trucks trying to reach northern Gaza. Israel denies breaking the terms of the truce it agreed to. Senior Israeli government advisor Mark Regev.
This whole truce, this whole humanitarian ceasefire is based on the release of our hostages. Those hostages have to be released in accordance with the understandings reached. If they're not, then, as I say, everything is predicated on that release.
News of a delay also sent ripples of anxiety through crowds in the occupied West Bank, awaiting the release of more loved ones being held in Israeli jails, women, children, and teenagers under the age of 19. Ibrahim Wada was expecting his daughter home yesterday, jailed 8 years ago in connection with a stabbing attack when she was 16. If she doesn't come home tonight, he told us then, she'll come home tomorrow. The chances of that improved with news that a delegation from Qatar had arrived in Israel in an attempt to get the exchange back on course, along with help from Egyptian negotiators. For Gazans, where well over 1 million people have been forced to leave their homes, the lifeline offered by the truce, however short, is critical. The sound of aid trucks crossing into Gaza from Egypt in greater numbers, a welcome sound. Long lines forming on the streets of people carrying canisters, hoping to find cooking fuel for sale. And there were also those venturing out in search of touchstones from homes destroyed. I tried to gather everything that was close to my heart, says this woman, but I couldn't. Everything is destroyed. If the truce holds through to the end of Monday, there is still the possibility of an extension if Hamas continues to release groups of Israeli hostages in exchange for jailed Palestinians. But today's wobble will reassure very few.
That report from CBC's Margaret Evans in Jerusalem. Turning now to Russia's war on Ukraine. Residents of an apartment building in Kyiv clean up glass from shattered windows. Officials say the Ukrainian capital was hit by one of the largest Russian drone attacks since the start of the war. 5 people, including a child, have been injured. Now, there are worries that military aid to Ukraine might stop as the world's attention shifts to the war between Israel and Hamas. The CBC's senior defense and security reporter, Murray Brewster, has been looking into that issue, and he spoke to us about it. Murray, this time last year, it was the war in Ukraine. That was the story dominating the headlines. But things have changed. It's now the war in the Mideast. That's what global attention is focused on. So can you briefly bring us up to speed? Where does the conflict between Ukraine and Russia stand in the wake of Ukraine's spring offensive?
Well, you have to remember that Ukraine has 200,000 Russian troops to dislodge, and the progress has been slow and steady. But in some respects, the counteroffensive has suffered from hype and political expectations that were set ahead of time, and they were set too high. Just recently, the Ukrainian Marines and Army forces crossed the Dnipro River in the south, and their bridgehead seems to be holding. Now, having said that, the gains in this war have been measured in just meters and a few kilometers at a time. There's been a lot of speculation about whether or not we can call this a stalemate. And Ukraine's top general earlier this month suggested that's where the war is headed. But U.S. officials and President Volodymyr Zelensky were reluctant to characterize it that way. But we are heading into the winter, where wet weather and, more importantly, weary Ukrainian army units mean the front line could be frozen into place.
Oh, wow. And then earlier this week, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin made a surprise visit to Ukraine to reassure President Zelensky that the U.S. hasn't forgotten about that war. But a U.S. military aid package for Ukraine has faced serious roadblocks in Congress. And also this week, Canada signaled less money in the coming years for military aid. So what sort of impact will both of those measures have?
The Biden administration in Washington has been scrambling to get all of its Ukraine aid out the door this year, or at least put the funding in place, because 2024 is an election year in the U.S. and you have elements of the Republican Party that have been questioning the blank check that has been given to Ukraine and calling for less aid in a very worst case scenario. But the U.S. is by far the biggest military donor, and it, like Canada and the EU, have been having trouble ramping up defense production and munitions. So there was a lot that Secretary Austin had to reassure President Zelensky about. Lately, the West has been trying to encourage Western defense companies to set up shop in Ukraine, which would mean less direct military aid coming from NATO and allied stockpiles and faster delivery for the Ukrainians. Now, that's why you may be seeing declining military aid in Canada's latest economic statement.
And then what about a little more broadly in Europe? Slovakia recently elected a government that is more pro-Moscow. Hungary has been balking at more aid for Ukraine. Is support waning in Europe, do you think?
Well, there's a weariness. That's definite. I mean, Slovakia's newly elected prime minister's called the war a frozen conflict. That was earlier this week. And also his government has begun the process of halting military aid. I mean, at the same time, too, I mean, one of the most staunchest allies of Ukraine, Poland, it had complaints during its recent presidential election, and the government in Warsaw made it clear that it wasn't going to be transferring any more military equipment to Ukraine either. So I mean, what we're seeing is fissures developing among Ukraine's more immediate neighbors. And those disagreements can be challenging for Europe going forward to maintain a united front on Ukraine.
And then speaking of united fronts, I guess, if the U.S. starts backing away from supporting Ukraine, where does that leave Canada? Will Ottawa feel some pressure to fill in the gap?
Compared to the United States, Canada is a small player. It could never fill the enormous gap that a scaling down in the U.S. would have. But a lot of Canadian aid has been economic. The Liberal government here has been cutting checks to keep the government in Kyiv afloat. And what we're likely to see is more of that. And the emphasis, though, seems to be on getting Ukraine to get on its own feet militarily, for at least from a production standpoint.
Okay, Murray, thank you so much for this.
You're welcome.
That's the CBC's senior defense and security reporter, Murray Brewster, in Ottawa. Thousands of people took to the streets to mark the 24th International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Demonstrations like this one in Madrid took place across multiple countries. Today marks the beginning of 16 days of activism to stop violence against women, girls, and LGBTQ people. Earlier this week, the United Nations said it is far from meeting its goal to end gender-based violence by 2030. Sima Bahous is the executive director of UN Women.
We are going backwards. Economic crisis, conflicts, and climate change all serve to add fuel to this fire. This must stop. It is time to acknowledge what works and to resource it.
The UN says more than 86% of women and girls across the world are living in countries without strong legal protections. While several lawsuits have been filed in New York State this week, many against high-profile men accusing them of sexual assault. Among them, former Governor Andrew Cuomo, who is being sued by a former aide, and rap mogul Sean Diddy Combs, who is facing 2 new accusations of sexual abuse just 1 week after he settled a lawsuit with his former partner. Both men deny the accusations. The timing of the lawsuits is no accident. They were filed under a state law that expired on Friday. As Chris Reyes reports, advocates say that law should be extended.
Really want to thank the governor.
New York City Mayor Eric Adams.
Look me in the eye and tell me that Cap is a better play.
Actor Jamie Foxx.
So if you wanna love me.
Musician Axl Rose, all sued in recent days for sexual assault. All have denied the allegations. Mayor Adams claiming this.
This is something that has never happened. I don't even recall meeting the person.
The cases were filed last week in the final days of the New York Adult Survivors Act, a law that gave a 1-year window for anyone to sue their alleged abuser, regardless of when an offense happened, as long as they were 18 or older at the time. New York Governor Kathy Hochul signed the law last year.
Which sounds harmless, statute of limitations, what could be wrong with that? Except it was a barrier to justice for too long.
Since the law went into effect, thousands of cases have been filed under the act, including against Donald Trump, who was found liable last May for sexually abusing the writer E. Jean Carroll in an incident that happened in the 1990s. Other high-profile cases include New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, Bill Cosby, and media personality Russell Brand. Add to that, a majority of the cases involve sexual abuse in New York's prisons. The law expired Thanksgiving Day, but New York lawyer Michael Wilhelmine said there is legal argument to be made for an extension because the expiry date fell on a holiday.
Given the urgency of the timeline now, we're obviously working sort of around the clock to make sure that anyone who has a viable and legitimate claim of sexual assault has an opportunity to get that claim heard in on time.
This year, Wilhelmine's firm Wigdor LLP has represented more than a dozen people in their sexual assault claims that go back decades, including against music mogul and entrepreneur Sean Diddy Combs, who settled with his accuser. Wilhelmine says the law and the attention it's been getting in the last year has been empowering for his clients.
A lot of the calls that we're fielding or emails that we're receiving are, I saw that case, and that has inspired me to come forward as well. So I think part of it is a domino effect where it's sort of strength in numbers in a sense.
Still, Wilhelmine's concern is that for some, they're learning about the new law's one-year window too late. He hopes there will be a consideration for expanding the law nationwide and extending the expiration date.
I think the legislature probably should go back and look at what has happened in the last week, and are there people that fell through the cracks that a reasonable extension of this law could protect.
Advocates for victims of sexual abuse were instrumental in passing the New York Adult Survivors Act. One of their arguments, that it often takes time for victims to build up the power to come forward. Chris Reyes, CBC News, New York.
In Alberta, Premier Danielle Smith has confirmed CBC News reporting that she plans on putting a controversial law into action.
A story published last night says you're going to make good on your threat to invoke the Sovereignty Act next week. True or false? And if so, why now? What's the process?
Well, true, but people will have to wait until Monday to see the architecture of it.
On her radio show, Smith says she will use the Sovereignty Act to shield Alberta power companies from federal clean energy regulations. Smith's government will introduce a resolution declaring Ottawa's plan to slash power grid emissions unconstitutional. The Premier says she's using the law because of her frustrations with Ottawa.
I've had it with Stephen Guilbeault, the Environment Minister. We have been trying to work collaboratively with them on aligning their targets with our targets. We have to have a reliable grid. We have to have an affordable grid. And we're going to make sure that we defend our constitutional jurisdiction to do that.
This will be the first time Smith's government actually uses the law, which passed last December. It was created to enable Alberta to push back against federal laws that it says encroach on the province's jurisdiction. Now, Indigenous businesses contribute tens of billions of dollars to the economy, and that number is growing. At a conference this week on Bay Street, government, corporate, and Indigenous leaders came together. James Dunn tells us what they are asking for.
Morning, Sydney. How's it going?
Rob Tebb and his wife Catherine own a high-tech machine shop in Regina. Extended Machine and Hydraulics makes parts, primarily for the mining industry. Tebb is Métis and has a staff of 26, more than half of them Indigenous. He can see the family business getting a lot bigger.
The opportunity is there to just grow this business to 4 or 5 times the size that it is right now.
That potential comes from a procurement program created to help Indigenous companies sell into the defense industry. Thanks to it, Tebb's now making parts for military vehicles.
This is going to be a huge breakthrough for our company.
A breakthrough is exactly what author Carol Ann Hilton says is happening for the Indigenous economy in Canada.
Indigenous peoples are economic powerhouses.
That's her giving the keynote address at the Indigenomics on Bay Street event in Toronto. Hilton says there's a reason to have the conference in the financial capital of the country.
It brings this focus to an invitation for corporate Canada to respond.
Hilton's determined to change the old idea that Indigenous peoples are a financial liability to the reality she sees, that they're an economic plus. Her conference brought together a mix of government, corporate, and Indigenous leaders to talk about getting the Indigenous economy from $50 billion a year, where Statistics Canada had it in 2020, to $100 billion within a few years.
They think it is so important to have that number and set a goal.
Tabitha Bull is the CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business and was one of dozens of speakers at the 2.5-day event. Panels were organized around key strategies to generate wealth, supply jobs, and push to the $100 billion goal, like major infrastructure builds, clean energy projects, raising investment capital, and those procurement policies to support Indigenous companies.
If you think about the government who spends around $20 billion annually, a 5% commitment is significant injection into the Indigenous economy.
Bill Lomax is the CEO of the First Nations Bank of Canada. His background includes 20 years in banking and finance in the U.S. and a long stint with American tribal nations, managing a portfolio worth more than $2 billion. His background includes 20 years in banking and finance in the U.S. and a long stint with American tribal nations, managing a portfolio worth more than $2 billion.
So there's a massive amount of money that the tribes in the States are making.
He says with Indigenous people participating in natural resource and energy projects and developing real estate with urban reserves and more, that $100 billion goal isn't far away.
The way things are going, we could see that happen within 5 years easily. I think we're on that cusp here, where we're starting to see First Nations really participate in the economy in a way they never have before.
Indigenous people are picking up business as a tool and using it as a stake in the ground to say we're still here.
Hilton, who wrote a book called Indigenomics in 2021, points out that a good news story for the Indigenous economy,
I feel very much that this is a powerful time to be alive,
is a good news story for Canada as well. James Dunn, CBC News, Toronto.
Journalism programs in Canada are facing a potential existential crisis. Fewer young people are expressing interest in the news business, and that's forcing some schools to cancel their programs altogether. Deanna Sumanak-Johnson tells us what some schools are doing to turn things around.
Journalism is a pillar of democracy, right?
Fernando Bossois came all the way from Brazil to study journalism in Canada.
Without journalism, we would not give voice to people to express their opinion, and we would live in a place that only the government and only people who are in power, they would stay in power, and we would not have this other side.
Then he found out his Bachelor of Journalism program at Toronto's Humber College is pausing admissions after this year due to low enrollment. Last year, his class had 7 students. Now it's down to 4.
It doesn't make for a good student experience, right?
Guillermo Acosta, the senior dean of the faculty that runs the program at Humber, says it was a tough decision.
Because a good part of journalism school is to have the debate and the different opinions and, have the opportunity to work in teams and to get crews to go in the field and work.
In the last year, 6 journalism programs at Canadian post-secondary schools were forced to either close doors or pause admissions because of low enrollment. University of Regina pressed pause. Associate Dean of Arts Tom McIntosh.
It has a long and rather, we think, distinguished history. So we wanted to give it a chance to restructure itself, reform itself, in the hopes of attracting new students.
The reasons for the enrollment numbers range from changes within the industry, including major layoffs, to younger generations' lower interest in traditionally delivered news. Saranaz Barfarouche is an assistant professor at University of British Columbia School of Journalism, Writing and Media.
This low number could mean a lot of things. It could mean a general disinterest in the news. It could mean the job market and how students or people who are interested in becoming journalists later see their future.
It's certainly something Fernando Bossois has heard from his friends.
You hear from other students as how we're not taking journalism, that they say, why are you taking this? There are not really jobs available.
But it's not all bad news. The top journalism schools in the country, like Toronto Metropolitan University, Carleton or Concordia, are noting robust or even growing enrollment. What these schools say they've done is updated lessons to include more contemporary approaches to storytelling, including journalism and social media, podcasting, and data journalism. Programs also have to take a hint from what young people see as troublesome practices in mainstream journalism, says Saranaz Barfarouche from UBC.
For example, coverage of issues related to race, sexuality. So I think in our education and training, we need to reflect this paradigm shift.
As for Fernando Bossois, he will complete his program and wants to be part of a generation that breathes fresh air into an industry in transition. Deanna Sumanak-Johnson, CBC News, Toronto.
You're listening to The World This Weekend on CBC Radio. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. You can listen to this program anytime on the CBC Listen app or on the CBC News YouTube channel. Want to make Drake sing a song you wrote? Well, there's an app for that. Artificial intelligence has allowed anybody to create songs that sound like their favorite artists. And now, thanks to Canadian researchers, that includes songs by birds. Emily Chung reports.
That's the call of the Virginia rail. It's one of the secretive birds that live in North American marshes. They only come out in the twilight. Kyle Drake is with Birds Canada.
So you're relying on your ears for everything anyways. And likewise, a lot of the species that are detected in marshes reside in the really thick, dense, emergent vegetation.
That's why conservationists use audio recorders
to monitor population status or to learn about different species' response to habitat change.
And protect important bird habitats like wetlands. Efforts like this now have help. Apps that let anyone upload bird calls from their phone and use artificial intelligence to identify the bird that made them. The problem? Those AIs need to be trained with many calls from each bird, says Professor Nicholas LeConte at the University of Moncton.
Sometimes it's not possible. You need to record those data, and for that, sometimes you need to access very remote places. For instance, birds that can live in the deep jungle or deep into the tundra in the Arctic.
Studying Arctic birds like the American golden plover inspired him to develop an AI called Ecogen. It helps train other AIs to identify rare birds by creating many new versions of a bird call from just one or a few samples. LeConte recalls the moment it created a bird call that sounded authentic.
We thought we were listening to a real one, and it was not. We reached a level where for sure the bird can listen to it and believe that's another bird.
LeConte says his work has many uses, like identifying new or rare kinds of birds entering an area, or teaching endangered baby birds the song of their species.
AI there's a lot of potential to do good things, and then we hope that this is a good example for that.
He says in the future, it could even be used for sounds made by mammals or fish. Emily Chung, CBC News, Toronto.
As Emily explained, AI can do a lot, but I don't think it can quite do this. What you're hearing is the song of a sparrow, combined with music made from the bioelectricity of a British Columbia cottonwood tree. It's the work of Vancouver-based artist Ruby Singh. His latest album, Polyphonic Garden Suite 2, takes listeners on a trip through the forests of BC, allowing them to hear plants, mushrooms, and amphibians in a whole new way, using their vibrations. Here's how he explained his work to CBC Radio's North by Northwest.
I started putting contact mics in the dirt and hydrophones, just listening to the roots kind of slowly snap and crumble. Then in my research, I discovered this technology that had been around, I guess, since about the late 70s, of measuring the various different bioelectricities of different creatures. And then that is converted into MIDI information that gives you pitch and rhythm information.
We just some West Coast anarchists, avocado amethyst.
At the same time, Singh released another album, the hip-hop collaboration Kraken. Both, he says, reflect on the climate crisis, but with different tones.
They're clamorous. We come from clans of vandalists. The land in us demands a certain candidate.
Singh says the process has made him more in tune with the sometimes subtle sounds of the natural world.
I would say that this project has had me listening at a level that I've never really listened at. If we can start to notice these small pieces of magic that are around us all the time in the natural world, and really I'd say everywhere, I think we start to care for our world more.
We'll leave you with a little more from Ruby Singh and the sounds of an old-growth forest on Vancouver Island. This is Fairy Creek Lament on The World This Weekend. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Thanks for listening.